Hey, before we get into the show proper, this is just a quick reminder that Writing on Games is now on Patreon. If you feel like you're getting something positive from the show, or it's making you think about games differently, if you would consider pitching in, then I would be eternally grateful. If not, that's also totally cool. I'm not going anywhere, don't worry. I also just want to take the time to thank the people who have already supported it. Your generosity has been utterly astounding to me. Also, I know that this is yet another Dark Souls episode, which I feel speaks a lot to the series' quality since there is so much to take from it, but I feel like I should change things up a little, so I promise the next episode won't be focused on Dark Souls. I have some potentially interesting ideas on getting more content out there anyway, so subscribe if you want to keep updated on that, and don't if you don't. Now, with that stuff out of the way, on with the show. Hi, I'm Hamish Black, and welcome to Writing on Games. I'm aware that I said in my thank you video that this episode would be on Metal Gear Solid, and don't worry, that episode is coming, but after continuing to play through my New Game Plus in Dark Souls 3, I noticed something specific that I wanted to discuss. I'll state up front that I'm absolutely enamoured with the game, despite the fact that in my last video I mentioned that playing this game for review was almost entirely antithetical to its core design, and as a result became an exponentially more stressful experience. I can't seem to pull myself away. I've been going through my experiences with the game and trying to collect my thoughts on why this has been the case. In particular, I've been trying to make sense of the idea that this game does many of the things that Dark Souls 2 did in terms of its core mechanics, such as leveling for example, and yet I find myself feeling more strongly than ever that Dark Souls 2 was a disappointment, whilst this game feels like it could be on par with Dark Souls 1 in terms of quality. As I was playing through 3, a key difference between it and 2, and a similarity between 3 and 1, in particular clicked with me. As I mentioned in my Dark Souls 2 video, I feel that that game fundamentally misunderstood the tone that the first game in the series was going for. We can get this out of the way now. When I say the first game, I don't mean Demon's Souls, I mean Dark Souls. That is to say, whilst Dark Souls 2's world felt sadistically focused on the player, in 1 and 3, the worlds could be characterised as crucially indifferent to the player's presence. I believe this is absolutely key to the way in which I have come to form my opinions on Dark Souls 3's quality, because hey, sadism in video games is easy, it's rote. It plays on the inherent need for the person controlling the experience to be at the centre of the events occurring around them. Indifference is like good horror, and this is something I will reference at multiple points in this video. It relies on atmosphere, on unsettling the person experiencing it. Dark Souls 2 needed to make the player aware that the world is out to get them at every opportunity. Dark Souls 1 and 3 have that idea built into the very core of their world and narrative design. As a result, these games are subtle and unsettling in a way that 2 simply was not to me. The main way that 3 conveys this to the player, and what resonated with me so significantly, is that the aggression and hostility shown towards the player in 2 feels very video gamey. Dark Souls 1 and 3, on the other hand, exemplify their hostility to the player by consistently highlighting that the world would exist whether the player was there to experience it or not. Now, as some of you may know from watching my other videos, I take a very positive message from Dark Souls 1, namely that it's an allegory for depression, and that playing through and overcoming its challenges can act as a means by which to confront your own problems, rather than adhering to the common talking point about video games, which is to say that they are considered a means of escapism, of running away from the real world. Part of why I think this can be exemplified in one particular area of that first game, and it has honestly remained one of the most profound parts of that game for me. I'm talking about the entry point to the New Londo Ruins, immediately after you exit the elevator that you take down from the Firelink Shrine. You enter this area, and you are confronted with a number of hollows that, at least at the start, the game has shown to be one of the few enemies that the player can effectively engage in combat. In the Undead Asylum, the player's experiences with them are either characterised by them being tutorialised as docile targets to practice on, or by their frenzied attack patterns and what feel like ruthless ambushes and traps. However, when you encounter a great deal of them in New Londo, none of them are immediately hostile towards the player. Instead, they squirm on the ground in agony, some looking as if they are praying for the pain to stop, others in a state of mourning, others quietly contemplating the futility of their existence. It is clear that what we have been told about the hollowing process has left their minds in a state of disrepair. This was the moment where I realised what this game was trying to say about the anguish that depression can often bombard someone with. What is key here, and why this area remains so profound to me, is that the beings the player up until this point has been told are enemies are now totally indifferent to the player. This helped recontextualize my encounters with the Hollows. Some people use these to farm small amounts of souls for the sake of leveling up, but this experience of wandering through these individuals when they were entirely consumed in the anguish of their own minds felt like the game was de-incentivizing killing them in a way. If I did kill them, it felt like I was putting them out of their misery. As I encountered hostile versions of this enemy later on in the game, they began to feel like beings defending their territory that the player is intruding on. As a player, it began to have a strange kind of distancing effect. It highlighted the player's insignificance as a being in this world. The unsettling nature of a game having enemies whose first priority wasn't necessarily to focus on the player was uncanny in the way that good atmospheric horror is. These beings have their own agendas, and that is unnerving in a medium that so often places the player in a position of empowerment. This also helps to signify to the player the ambiguity of this world, later exemplified, for example, in the fight with Artorias, a man with good intentions swallowed by the abyss he was trying to stem. Now, in many ways, I think Dark Souls 2 missed the mark on this kind of atmosphere. I won't go too deep on it because all of that is in my full video analysis of Dark Souls 2, but from the very start of the game it felt like the developers were focusing on making your experience as difficult as possible. This is why in that video I refer to Dark Souls 2 as the equivalent of forcing jump scares in your face, as opposed to the thoughtful horror of the first game. I told you I'd keep referring back to it, didn't I? Not only is this evidenced by the hokey nature of the game's intro, but the way that in 2, there are no moments that I can remember of enemies appearing as anything other than solely trying to eliminate the player. And if you have any examples, then please let me know. The only example I can think of are the Heidi Knights, who are not hostile until the player attacks, but they lack the element that recontextualized the enemies in the first game for me, the humanity imbued in them by something as simple as their movement. I get that these are presumably stoic knights who are pretty dedicated to their job, but in a sheer kinetic sense, they are entirely static until the player attacks them and they suddenly rush to life to eliminate the player. If the Hollows in 1 had merely been sitting there, then the effect would have been muted to say the least. The movement is a subtle but key means of actually characterizing these beings. They don't need speech, they don't need to tell the player that they are feeling a certain way. They simply sway from side to side, clutching their heads in agony, and this is enough to convey both their anguish and the idea that the player's place in the world has suddenly become a lot more difficult to define. So how does Dark Souls 3 make the move back to the subtle but crucial sense of indifference of the first Dark Souls game from the gauche, trite, player-as-centre sadism provided in 2? Well, it actually does this in a very similar way to 1. Especially early on in the game, 1 finds many of the same kind of non-hostile undead in the High Wall of Lothric that 1 comes across in the New Londo ruins, for example. In many ways, the enemies here become more complex. It is not simply a case of these guys being non-hostile compared to the actual enemies, as the game teaches you very early on that not only can enemies be hiding amongst these crowds of seemingly friendly beings, but as you proceed, you find that many of these beings can be awoken in a way by a particular enemy character that sets them on you after making a call to them. Not only this, but hiding within a select few can sometimes be found the same kind of grotesque, frenzied monster found in the Iudex Gundyr fight, for example. I believe in this form they are referred to as Pus of Man, which by the way is the name of my next grindcore band, ready to burst out and assault the player with a barrage of brutal attacks. The effect this had on my particular experience, coming at this as someone for whom the non-hostile enemies in the New Londo ruins so resonated with, was particularly interesting. It gradually wore down my resolve. as I saw these creatures praying for the presumed pain to stop in the same way that they might have in Dark Souls 1, and cowering from my attacks, and I felt bad for killing them. But the game was flat out encouraging me to approach these creatures in the same way I would approach other enemies, slowly, ready to strike at any moment. The realisation that some of these creatures could in fact burst into their pussive man form at any second led me to attack everyone I could find. At the very least, I could justify this on a mechanical level, as I was accruing souls for it, but eventually, at the undead settlement, the souls suddenly stopped. The game just flat out stops rewarding the player with even the measly amount of souls these non-hostile creatures were providing at the start of the game. At this point, to me, it felt like as soon as I could ascertain that these creatures posed literally no threat and I gained no reward for killing them, it simply felt sadistic to attack them. In fact, in many situations, especially in the undead settlement, it feels like the player is intruding on events already in progress that would happen whether or not the player was present. Examples of this include the ritualistic prayer led by the cathedral evangelist, in which the enemies don't aggro unless the player gets particularly close, if they intrude on the ceremony, that is to say. Another example of this, and this is perhaps one of the dumbest yet most brilliant moments in the game for me, is when you first arrive at the foot of the high wall. The player descends down the stairs to witness the castle gate being opened, and dogs being unleashed on a group of hollows. The dogs attack and kill the hollows unless the player intervenes. Following this, the player can approach the hollows that stop at the player's feet, mouth agape, assumedly completely unaware of what just happened. But what's crazy about this, to me anyway, is that the player has just saved hollows within the world of a Dark Souls game. This has no consequence on the subsequent events in any way, but yet again it adds a level of depth to the world that is at once dark, obscure and comic. This might be me reading into things way too much, but in a game that seemingly asserts itself as a totally combat-driven experience in which everything is out to destroy the player, this realisation that the game is actively incentivising killing certain enemies and being on one's guard whilst simultaneously and subtly humanising, or at the very least characterising, many of the creatures in this world is kind of brilliant. Video games, especially combat-focused ones, often teach us that everything in front of a player is hostile and must be eliminated. By implementing the same kind of humanising design found in Dark Souls 1, the game illustrates that the world of 3 is indifferent to the player, as opposed to 2's more overtly sadistic attitude, making the former inherently deeper and more interesting than the latter. Now, of course, this isn't to say that Dark Souls is the only game series that does this. In other RPGs like Fallout and Elder Scrolls, you often come across emergent events in which characters are fighting a battle long before the player character arrives on the scene. The difference here is that in these scenarios you are often expected to pick a side, help out and usually become the hero of your chosen side's particular quest line. In these cases, you are the one person that can solve these situations. That said, obviously RPGs like this are arguably not going for the same kind of atmosphere that Dark Souls is. And even with this little bit of effort put into staging events that the player stumbles into, rather than everything seeming like it's being caused as a result of the player's presence, helps to characterise the world and make it feel more tangible. As much as you might want to believe otherwise, in real life you are not the centre of the universe. The idea that a game represents that in a world where games are so often created to be power fantasies for the player is inherently refreshing, if not at all empowering. This is arguably the reason Dark Souls isn't escapism in the same way other games are. It uses this small detail of how the denizens of this world act towards you in order to show you that you are not their priority here. Power fantasies allow you to pretend to be something you're not. Dark Souls subverts this by confronting the player with exactly what they are. A largely insignificant being with the power to improve only their own existence, even if it doesn't necessarily correlate with the fantasy of saving the world that so many games assert. And with all of that said, that concludes the first patron-backed episode of Writing on Games. Thank you all so much for watching, and as I stated at the start, if you feel like you've taken something positive from this episode, if you would consider supporting the show financially, then I'd be eternally grateful, and totally non-judgmental if you can't or simply don't want to. Just by watching, you all mean the absolute world to me. Anyway, thank you again so much for watching. I'm Hamish Black, and this has been Writing on Games. I'll see you next time.